Turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Today's topic, the 1985 CBS miniseries, Alice in Wonderland. I've made reference to this rendition of the Alice stories a couple of times in earlier reviews, so it seems like the best candidate to cover now. This two-part TV miniseries was made for CBS as a passion project by Irwin Allen, a director and producer of both movies and TV who was known for his extremely campy and colorful sense of style and fantastical subject matter. Many of his works were fairly low budget and relied heavily on star power and their own general strangeness to find an audience. Needless to say, the world of Wonderland was an interesting world for Allen and the rest of his creative team to handle. Once again, this production was a star-studded musical spectacular, made on a budget of $14 million and featuring major stars of the time to fill in the roles of Carol's characters. At first, Heather O'Rourke, who many will know for her work in the horror film Poltergeist, was considered for the title role of Alice. However, when O'Rourke turned out to have some contract issues, the role was instead given to a lesser-known but no less talented Natalie Gregory, who was made up and given a special wig to deliberately try and resemble Rourke. You can decide if this decision was even worth making or not. Gregory to date is one of the youngest people to play the character, having been cast at roughly 10 years of age. Some may recall her as the voice of Jenny Foxworth from Disney's Oliver & Company, which came out 3 years later. Speaking of Disney, while Allen was the producer and had a big hand in the creation of this show, it was actually directed by Harry Harris, and he reportedly drew much of his inspiration from the 1951 Disney animated feature. Alongside Gregory's youth and the cast of A and B listers, perhaps the most noteworthy thing about this production is the way it mixes the two books, or rather, doesn't mix them. In other productions, it's not uncommon for there to be bits of Looking Glass mixed into the adventure storyline, but that's the key word: bits, moments, scenes, a few characters. There are very few full-length adaptations of Through the Looking Glass on its own, and while many productions do tend to blend the books together, they rarely adapt both at the same time. The two-part miniseries format allowed the creators to do exactly that. The first part is an adaptation of the first book, and the second part is an adaptation of the second book, with some story elements and characters mixed into both to stitch them together into one long and semi-cohesive whole. In a rarity for Wonderland adaptations, this one was actually a modest success. It earned fairly good ratings and was well received by most critics. It was even nominated for no less than 5 Emmy Awards for sound design, art direction, costumes, hair, and makeup. However, as time has passed, this mid-80s dish of Crayola-colored ham and cheese has been largely forgotten by audiences. So, does it still hold up, or is it merely a dated product of the times? For starters, this production is bizarrely Americanized, and I say bizarrely specifically because despite various characters using English isms, so to speak, and the fact there's a portrait of Queen Victoria in Alice's home, most of the cast are American actors and speak with overwhelmingly American accents. They don't even attempt an English dialect. But trust me, this is far from the most curious thing in this version. Because this miniseries is able to adapt both books into 2 separate parts, each one roughly feature-length, some have declared it as one of the most accurate depictions of the story to date. Well, it is and it isn't. There are several characters found in this version that can't be found in most other adaptations, and as far as the presence of said characters goes, this one definitely hits most of the high marks. Considering Alice is a very character-driven piece, as I've stated time and time again, one could make the argument it's among the most accurate, if not the most accurate, by that point alone. But this version does take many significant liberties with its source material all the same. Much of Carol's dialogue is paraphrased, presumably to appeal to a more modern and American audience, and despite being a musical, most of Carol's songs and poems from the books are completely ignored in favor of original tunes. Also, while most of the major and even minor characters are present, their role in things is at times rather different. The Dodo in the books is one of the first major characters Alice encounters, and while he's not around for long in the original story, he leaves a big impression. In the miniseries, despite the fact the character is being played by none other than Shelley Winters of all people, the character is reduced to a cameo role. The Dodo is kept mostly to the background with practically nothing to do, which feels like a disservice to both the character and the actress. This is not the only case, as several other characters either have their roles lessened or even expanded throughout the production. As a result, it's rather difficult to gauge just how accurate this version really is. It has virtually everything, true, but it also changes quite a lot at the same time. Tied to this, the story of the miniseries is once again a production that deals with a moral lesson, as Alice is taught to face her fears and learns what it truly means to grow up, and both the good and bad that comes with it. In the first act of the miniseries, based on the first book, the storyline remains mostly pretty loose and zany, sticking largely to Carol's nonsensical concept, but things take a sudden turn at the end of the first part when Alice returns home only to be tormented by the monstrous Jabberwock, and here a living manifestation of her fears and anxieties. From that point on, the story becomes about Alice trying to get home and escape the Jabberwock, as the monster pops up several times pretty much out of nowhere just to frighten her some more. In fact, a lot of people claim things get pretty scary when the Jabberwock comes out to play. I will say I was not expecting the creature to be as dangerous as it truly was. Instead of Humpty Dumpty, played by Jonathan Winters, simply falling off the wall by accident, the Jabberwock actually pushes him off. Not only that, but we never see Humpty again, and no attempt is made to put him back together. So yeah, as far as we know, the monster outright murdered him. However, I don't really find the Jabberwock itself to be all that scary. Every time I see it, I think it just got lost on its way to the set of Godzilla King of the Monsters. Actually, come to think of it, Godzilla vs. the Jabberwock would be amazing. Someone make that a thing. The music was the work of 3 people, composers Morton Stevens and Stephen... him, along with songwriter Steve Allen, no relation to Irwin Allen. The incidental music is pretty good, both very mellow and bright for the most part, and quite pleasant on the ears, but able to resound with a thundering roar when things go wrong for Alice on her quest. As for Allen's songs, they tend to be hit or miss. Some are catchy and fun, others haunting and mysterious, and the rest are either boring or obnoxious. In fact, the songs in this production can be very directly tied to the cast. You can basically split the cast up into 4 categories: perfect, musically imperfect, and why the heck are they even here? The perfect actors are those who are not only excellent portrayers of their respective roles in general, but get the best songs and sell them for all they are worth. For example, Telly Savalas is the Cheshire Cat. He's not my favorite take on the character by any means, but he does a good job with what he's given. I mean, it's Blofeld from Bond as the Cheshire Cat, of course he's awesome. He also gets probably my favorite song in the entire production, the unsettling tune, No Way Home. Musically perfect actors are those who have great songs and do well there, but when they aren't singing and dancing, they can't seem to hold their own. A good example here is Sammy Davis Jr. as the Caterpillar. Now don't get me wrong, Sammy Davis Jr. is a powerhouse performer, and is shown in other productions to be a competent actor as well as a gifted singer and dancer. But this is not the production to showcase that, as his caterpillar feels very stilted and is actually quite grating. The utterly snicker-worthy costume he's forced into doesn't help matters either. I can only imagine the relief good old Sammy felt when he was allowed to transmogrify for his musical number and tap dance freely around the set. His rendition of You Are Old Father William is a highlight of the show for me, but I tend to fast forward to the song and ignore the scene around it for good reason. Musically imperfect actors actually seem to take up the majority. These actors actually come into subcategories, essentially. Some of them are essentially the opposite of Sammy Davis Jr.'s issue, where their acting is absolutely amazing, but either their songs or their singing leave much to be desired. The second case involves actors who, once again, are perfectly suited on the acting front, but actually don't get much of a chance to even attempt a song on their own. For an example of the first case, Lloyd Bridges as the White Knight is absolutely wonderful in his performance. You have never met a kinder puppy dog of a man in your life. It's like if you put Santa Claus in a suit of armor, he's just so infectiously lovable. Unfortunately, while his acting is absolutely splendid and his singing voice, while not brilliant, has plenty of emotion and is sweet to listen to, I find his musical number, We Are Dancing, to be one of the weakest in the soundtrack. As for an example of the second case, we have Robert Morley as the King of Hearts. To be blunt, this is about as perfect a casting choice as you could possibly make, as Morley's voice and bubbly comic style make him the single most fitting person to play the king I've ever seen. However, he gets very little time to sing, and to be fair, when he does sing, his voice is not exactly the best. Finally, we have the Why the Heck Are You Even Here actors. As you might guess, these are the performers who have no reason to be here whatsoever. Their acting is unappealing, their songs equally so, and they seriously feel out of place in this whole debacle. Now, there is no finer example of this than the late Carol Channing as the White Queen. Now, I should say that I have nothing at all against Carol Channing, as a person or as a performer. She was a fine lady who did some great work in her time, and I have nothing but respect for her. But she's also a performer who I think you have to be extremely cautious with. Her highly distinctive voice and hyperactive sense of style and technique made her someone who needed to be cast carefully. In the right role, she becomes one of the greatest portrayals of the part you'll ever know. In the wrong role, well, you get the White Queen. That thick, Southern Belle-sounding voice and her zany antics feel completely out of place for the character, and she tends to come across as either obnoxious or even downright creepy. I've said time and time again that Wonderland is a world where melodrama can be allowed easily, but this is really pushing just how far out of left field you can go before you're kicked out of the game. Now, to be fair, while the cast is one giant mixed bag, as many of these big-name productions tend to be, a lot of the casting issues probably were not the fault of the actors or even the director. It may interest you to know that I actually had a correspondence with Natalie Gregory herself for a time, though we sadly fell out of contact a few years ago. During our chats, she revealed to me that most of the people in the production were cast simply due to contractual obligations. They didn't really have much of a choice. In fact, according to Gregory, she remembered that many of her older castmates complained frequently about how uncomfortable they felt in their costumes and makeup, and considering many of them look like plush toys, I don't blame them. And the shooting of the project was actually done on a bit of a tight schedule. It's entirely possible that the fact all these puzzle pieces don't always fit together was due to a mixture of rushing to meet deadlines and just being tossed into a part by the casting people because they had to be. Considering all the hard work that clearly went into this production, I'd say they probably did about as well as they could under the circumstances. On the note of Natalie Gregory, she is undeniably one of my favorite people to play Alice, easily in my top 10. Admittedly, in the early parts of the film, her acting is a little off and comes across a bit awkward, but as the miniseries goes on and she grows on you more and more, she seems to sink into things more easily. Despite her youth, she's extremely talented and makes for a very sincere, sweet, and thoroughly wonderful anchor for the story. She's vulnerable, but not fragile, and the fact that she is so young makes worrying about her all the easier. She also doesn't have too bad of a singing voice and proves to be alright in the dance sequences too, so she's definitely a character who fits into the category of perfect. While the sets and props are not as grandiose as they could be at times, and it's clear all of this is on a studio set, there's a lot of color and life to the world created by the artistic people. It's a very charming and vivid world they create, and they work well with what they have to give you a real treat for the eyes. The effects, as is often the case with these adaptations, I notice, tend to run the gamut from obvious and unbelievable to actually pretty darn good. However, I feel the miniseries has a bit of a tonal issue. Most of the time it's bright and cheerful and even really funny, with a lot of ingenious improvisations from the performers that actually make for some fun moments. But when it decides to get dark, it can become nightmarish. I've already mentioned the Jabberwock, but there are other moments too. For example, the fall down the rabbit hole in most versions, including the book, is meant to be a mysterious and slightly comical sequence, very dreamlike and serene as Alice drifts down surrounded by floating objects and musing to herself about all things weird and wonderful. In this one, we see a little girl plummet down a dark, dingy well into a cavern that is somehow filled with thunder and lightning, and it's all very claustrophobic in appearance and decidedly unpleasant in nature. In fact, some moments in this miniseries have been named as among the most frightening, nostalgic moments in television history. I don't think any of them are all that freaky for adults today, but I definitely see why they might have scared some kids back in the 80s, and perhaps could even scare some nowadays. While I'm all for there being a mixture of darkness and light in these sort of stories, kids need to be scared sometimes, it helps them grow. I mostly just feel the transitions from cheery wit to morbid terror feel extremely jarring. There's no real segue between them all. Then again, perhaps that was the point. Trying to catch the audience off guard and really drill the fear into them that things could go wrong at any moment. I suppose it's just all a matter of perspective. Despite all the issues I have with this version, I do still enjoy watching it from time to time, and while not everything in it works out, a lot of it really does. There are moments in this production that actually nearly bring one to tears when they hit home the right way, and others that just make you snicker and wonder what in the world the creators were thinking. Whether you're giggling at its goofiness or getting sucked into the story, it's bound to get a reaction out of you of some kind, and I'd say that, if nothing else, is deserving of some merit. And so we come to the conclusions. Rating 6 out of 10, The Hatter's Average. While this production is often obscured by more popular ones, it has, like many Alice adaptations, gained a bit of a cult following, and I can see why. In a way, its imperfections are part of what makes it so endearing. It's completely bonkers and doesn't always work out the way it should, but then that's what Wonderland is like itself. And seeing so many great talents gather together even when they aren't doing their finest work is really something to behold. So if this crazy, campy take on the story sounds like something you'd enjoy, check it out and take it for what it's worth. Just don't blame me if Carol Channing's songs make your ears bleed. Top 6 performances and characters. Lloyd Bridges as the White Knight. While I'm not a fan of his big musical number, Bridges' work overall overshadows that issue by a great deal. He's easily one of my favorite takes on the character, and his scenes are a highlight for me every time I see this one. Ringo Starr is the Mock Turtle, because the narrator of Thomas the Tank Engine automatically gets a lot of love from me, case closed. Telly Savalas is the Cheshire Cat. Sly, slick, and unnervingly ambiguous, you're never sure what to make of this take on the character. Never certain if he's Alice's friend or foe, which is just the way I like him. Plus, again, he probably gets the best song in the whole miniseries, so that definitely earns him some points. Anthony Newley, Roddy McDowall, and Art Johnson as the Mad Tea Party. Ironically, Newley's Mad Hatter is probably my least favorite of the trio, but I do still love him to bits. The real highlights for me here, however, are Roddy McDowall as the March Hare and Art Johnson as the Dormouse. All three put their all into things and get some of the funniest bits in the entire show, and have great chemistry with one another. Altogether, they are a ton of fun to watch. Natalie Gregory as Alice, a very good anchor for this hot mess of a production and very believable and interesting to watch. Instead of a handicap, her youth turns out to be part of what makes her so endearing, and you really do feel for her as she tries to figure out her way home and learns the lessons she's presented with. And Robert Morley is the King of Hearts. His wife, the Queen, is played by Jane Meadows, and while she's pretty good too, it's Morley as the King who steals the show for me. This is my choice for the definitive version of the character. It's the voice I hear in my head whenever I read the book. Alongside the Mad Tea Party goers, he's easily the funniest character in the whole story, and easily nails it as my all-time favorite. What other wonders await you down the rabbit hole? Join me next time to find out. This is JJ Hatter, and never forget, we're all mad here.